Who do you think was the most dangerous king in English history? Was it Richard III, the supposed murderer of the princes in the Tower? Or maybe Henry VIII, who executed two of his own wives? They were certainly ruthless, but I'd argue there was another monarch. One whose reign plunged England into a bloody, decades-long civil war and whose actions fundamentally changed the course of the nation's history. His name was King Stephen. Now you might be thinking, Stephen, who's that? And that's exactly why his story is so fascinating. He wasn't a monster in the way we think of villains. By all accounts, he was actually a pretty nice guy, charming, brave, and chivalrous. So how did this affable nobleman become the catalyst for one of England's darkest periods, known simply as the Anarchy? To understand this, we need to go back to the year 1120. King Henry I, a powerful and effective ruler, faced a devastating tragedy. His only legitimate son and heir, William Adelin, died in the White Ship disaster. This left Henry with a single legitimate child, his daughter Matilda. In an unprecedented move for the time, Henry made his barons swear an oath to support Matilda as his successor. This was a huge deal. A ruling queen was unheard of in England, and many powerful nobles were deeply uncomfortable with the idea of a woman on the throne. One of the most powerful barons who took this oath was Henry's favorite nephew, Stephen of Blois. Stephen was handsome, popular, and a formidable warrior. He had been raised in the English court and held vast lands in both England and France. When Henry I died in 1135, the stage was set for a showdown. Despite his oath, Stephen saw his chance. While Matilda was in Normandy, far from the center of power, Stephen acted decisively. He raced across the Channel to London, where the citizens who loved him hailed him as their king. He then secured the royal treasury at Winchester, and with the backing of powerful church leaders and nobles who preferred a male ruler, he was crowned King of England. He had effectively stolen the throne. At first, Stephen's reign seemed promising. He was generous and tried to win over his opponents with land and titles. But his kindness was seen as weakness. The barons, sensing a lack of firm control, began to build their own castles without royal permission, mint their own coins, and act like independent kings in their own lands. The kingdom was starting to fracture. Then, in 1139, the inevitable happened. Empress Matilda landed in England to claim her inheritance, and she wasn't alone. She had the support of her powerful half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, and a significant number of disgruntled barons. This was the spark that ignited the civil war known as the Anarchy. What followed was nearly 2 decades of chaos. England was split in two. Allegiances shifted constantly. Battles were fought, castles were besieged, and the countryside was ravaged by armies from both sides. But this wasn't just a war between two royal claimants. It was a free-for-all. Local lords used the power vacuum to settle old scores and grab land. Mercenary soldiers employed by both sides terrorized the population, burning villages, torturing peasants for their money, and destroying crops. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a primary source from the time, paints a terrifying picture. It says, "They filled the land full of castles. And when the castles were made, they filled them with devils and evil men. Then they took those whom they supposed to have any goods, and put them in prison for their gold and silver, and tortured them with unspeakable tortures." It describes a land where men said openly that Christ and his saints slept. This was the reality of Stephen's reign. The central authority of the crown had completely collapsed. So where was our nice guy king in all of this? Stephen was a brave soldier, always on the front lines, but he was a terrible strategist and an inconsistent ruler. One moment he was decisive, the next he was hesitant. His biggest blunder came in 1141 at the Battle of Lincoln. Stephen, fighting valiantly, was captured by Matilda's forces. For a brief period, it looked like the war was over. Matilda entered London and began preparing for her coronation. But Matilda had her own flaws. She was seen as arrogant and high-handed, and she quickly alienated the people of London, who drove her out of the city. Meanwhile, Stephen's fiercely loyal wife, also named Matilda, rallied his supporters. She managed to capture Matilda's key ally, Robert of Gloucester. This led to a prisoner exchange, Robert for King Stephen. The king was free, and the war was back on, with no end in sight. For years, England bled. The fighting ebbed and flowed, but neither side could land a decisive blow. Stephen controlled the east, Matilda the west. The country was exhausted. Farms lay fallow, trade ground to a halt, and people lived in constant fear. Stephen's dangerousness wasn't born of malice, but of incompetence. His inability to command loyalty, to make decisive choices, and to maintain order allowed the kingdom to descend into a state of brutal anarchy that a more tyrannical but effective king, like his predecessor Henry I, would never have tolerated. The long bloody stalemate was finally broken not by a battle, but by another tragedy. In 1153, Stephen's own son and heir, Eustace, died suddenly. Stephen was heartbroken and weary of the endless war. Around the same time, Matilda's son, a young and dynamic leader named Henry Plantagenet, invaded England. He was gathering support, and another full-scale war seemed imminent. But instead of more bloodshed, the exhausted parties came to an agreement. The Treaty of Wallingford was signed. Under its terms, Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but he had to adopt Matilda's son, Henry, as his heir. The crown would pass to the Plantagenet line. It was a peaceful end to a devastating conflict. King Stephen died just a year later, in 1154. He ruled for 19 long, terrible winters. He wasn't a tyrant who terrorized his people with his own cruelty, but his weakness and his initial act of usurpation unleashed the cruelty of a